Welcome to Let's Talk Higher Ed Careers, a podcast from Hurt Jobs. I'm Marcia Silva, Marketing and Communications Director at the Higher Education Recruitment Consortium, also known as HERC. This show is designed to help you explore, launch, and grow a career in higher education. Joining us today is Erin Grace Burns. She specializes in creative storytelling and design for higher education, nonprofits, and progressive faith-based organizations. She has led communications at Pacific School of Religion, the UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare, and HERC. Full disclosure, she is my predecessor, and I've known her for years before that when we both worked at a large food bank in the San Francisco Bay Area. Erin holds an MFA in illustration from the Savannah College of Art and Design and an undergraduate degree in political science and peace and conflict studies from Guilford College. We're excited to welcome Erin and hear more about her career journey. So I'll start off with our first question, which is kind of, tell us a bit about what you're doing today. What is your role and where do you work?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And for the past year or so, have been doing freelance communication. So, as you mentioned, I've been working with higher ed institutions, nonprofits, and then faith-based organizations, and any configuration of those in between. But doing communications means everything from website design to graphic design to messaging to communication strategy. So, yeah, prior to that, I worked for about 20 years, a long time now, in the nonprofit and higher ed sectors.
So talk about sort of your career path. How did you end up in your current role?
Sure. When I was in college at my undergrad, I was really involved with AIDS activism. I did a fellowship when I was there, and then that sort of turned into a job doing student organizing. So in a way, I've always been sort of connected to colleges and high school in that way, doing organizing work. But I did that for a few years. I worked for a couple nonprofits back in Florida, and I was trying to decide if I wanted to maybe be a social worker, maybe go to law school. And I ended up realizing I was missing doing art was always such a big part of my life. And that was always my favorite part of the jobs that I had was getting to, design a poster for a protest or a flyer. So I ended up going to art school at Savannah College of Art and Design, got my master's degree. And since then, I've been lucky to get to work on causes that I really care about, and to get to do the writing and the illustration and all the creative things that come with a communications job. So the creativity is what interests me the most in the day-to-day work, I will say. And it's been great to work at a couple of very different places in higher eds. And in my current role doing freelance, I'm getting to sort of step back and do the brand identity. And it's less like the day to day, but more here's the infrastructure that I can hand over to someone and help them be successful with it when they often have 20 other things on their plate, in addition to, oh, by the way, we need a whole new, visual identity for this organization. So it's been a really fun to figure out, I guess, the past couple of months doing freelance. I've always sort of done it on the side, but never full time. It's been great to, I will say, draw on the different experiences I had doing full time work and kind of bring that into the freelance sector.
Yeah, yeah. I think something we share so much in common is like that mission-driven work.
Yeah.
Because a lot of my career too has been in the nonprofit sector. And then obviously higher ed is very mission-driven.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about just how higher ed, working in higher ed it can be different from working in other sectors you've experienced?
Yeah. So for comparison, I've mostly worked in nonprofits. And I will say, the people are generally nice across both, which is great. You have some excellent colleagues, like yourself, Marcia. And I think what makes higher ed different is absolutely that mission driven piece. And then more specifically, I think it's such a great environment of constantly encouraging people to learn. I've gotten to, audit some courses at working at Berkeley. It's great to just, take your lunch hour and go learn about the James Webb Telescope. There's a lecture going on at the same time. So I will say, like, if you are interested in learning, higher ed is a great environment for that. And the other thing is, I think there's no universal higher ed experience. You can choose a small liberal arts college to work at, a community college, a big research institution, and the culture and the practices, I think, are very different at each one. But the collegiality is there. I think folks are very supportive of each other across departments and across units on campus, even at a bigger campus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think higher ed, you feel like every day you're showing up and doing something meaningful, which is really rewarding. I think you always sleep well at night if you have a job like that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Um, so if someone wants to grow in this field, what should they focus on learning or doing?
I
And
think the biggest thing with communications, and maybe it's even heightened in higher ed, but is really understanding your audience who may be very different from you. So I think in higher ed, you might be, trying to develop marketing materials for an 18-year-old who's about to graduate. You might be working with a donor who's 85. You might be working with a professor who's sort of in the middle of their career. And I think knowing what's the right message for each of those folks, who is the right messenger. Sometimes, maybe the dean needs to pick up the phone and give someone a call. And then what are their other communications experiences like? So do you need to be on Discord to reach an undergraduate audience, or does someone prefer email? So I think that's really key, is getting to know. I mean, it's sort of communications 101, but I've often heard too, well, we want to communicate with everybody. And that's not always the plan. I think the more specific you can be about who your audience is, the better. And then the other piece that I think is affecting all of our jobs right now, but it is just to keep up with, try to keep ahead of technology. I've seen, when I first started work, we maybe sent people emails. And so that was before the dawn of social media. And now there are all these great tools. Like, I think Canva is an amazing tool for anyone working in communications, because it's really democratized design quite a bit. I will say, try to have standardized brands, guidelines, templates, whatever. But I think you no longer have to have an extensive background in design to be able to turn out pretty professional looking, like, social media posts and things like that. But that is to say, I think you want to pair the tools with staying ahead of whatever the current trends are affecting, I guess, not only higher ed, but like I said earlier, what folks are seeing in the rest of their lives and what makes sense for your institution. Like, you don't necessarily have to talk like a graduating senior to attract graduating seniors to your institution. It's more important to be truthful to your institution and your values and the voice that you've developed.
how about what are you seeing with AI right now? Are you using it much? Yeah.
Okay, I know this is, I was just talking to my friend who's a professor who just absolutely, like, hates AI, will never use it, is not acceptable in her classroom. And then, the flip side of that is, in communications, especially if you are at a really resource strained environment, which sometimes you might be a team of one, how can you use these tools to not replace you, but, like, enhance your work and help you turn things out quicker? Whether that's brainstorming ideas for campaigns, or, helping you come up with a timeline for something that you want to launch. And like I said, I think it's getting more and more embedded, even with our project management tools. If you use something like Asana or Monday.com, it's in there and can help you offload a lot of your planning. So I know that AI is just such a loaded topic in higher ed. But I think it can be used ethically. I think institutions might be a little behind the curve with how they're sort of policing it and what is the guidance around it. So I will say, yeah, being aware of what your organization's policies are, and even individuals within your organization probably have wildly different opinions about using AI. So I would say proceed with caution, but I will say it's useful in a lot of ways for marketing, and I think you can use it in an ethical way.
Yeah. Um, Definitely helpful when you're a team of one, which is very like common
Yeah,
in
exactly.
well, nonprofit sector for sure, but anyway,
Yeah,
yes. So what are some emerging trends shaping your part of higher ed right now?
yeah. I feel like, without getting too into the weeds, if you've paid attention at all to higher ed over the past couple of years, there's been sort of declining faith in higher ed. There's been a loss of federal funding across the board. Tuition is going up, and I think higher ed, in a lot of ways, has had to defend itself and the importance of sometimes life-saving research in ways that it hasn't before. Because I think a lot of that is like higher ed just thinks I'll keep on humming behind the scenes, and I don't necessarily want to draw attention to myself, which is great and humble. And all of a sudden, we find these cuts coming to higher ed, and the public really needs an education sometimes about what is being lost. So I would say from that obviously affects communications quite a bit. And I think that really staying true to your organization's values and what you are founded on, and kind of leaning into that. I'll say a little shout out to my alma mater, which is a Quaker college, Guilford College in North Carolina. When every school, it seemed, across the country was erupting with student protests around Israel and Palestine, Guilford held a peace forum. And I think that is so, in the tradition of Quakerism around peace building, and the school in particular has a big presence in Palestine. And I think that that's a chance for higher ed to do what it does best, which is bring, sometimes conflicting views together, to think through solutions, to listen from folks who have a lived experience. And I think that school, being a Quaker institution, was very uniquely positioned to do that. Not everyone obviously has that heritage, but thinking through what your school values. Is it free speech? Is it a diversity of perspectives? Is it we're going to have a very intense, session where we hear from opposing viewpoints sometimes, and hopefully come up with some ideas, is very key, I think, right now, with the political atmosphere being what it is. And I think that higher ed has those values and has always had for a long time. So I think it's kind of reaffirming that, and making space for students, but also to have a strong, sort of consistent voice and plan for what to do, what happens if federal funding gets cut, or if our institution is investigated or needs to come up with a rapid response plan for how, we might deal with X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
yeah, it's definitely it's a place that higher ed has. It kind of has a higher ed a unique position to be able to do that, right? To be able to bring all the different voices together.
Very polarized, and I think that's what's, if it bleeds, it leads. Like, that's what's the more polarized incidences are what's attracting attention. And I think that if, where's the alternative to that? And like, I think part of communications would be offering up like alternative visions to, I think, this narrative of just division and conflict. And I think that's a place, like, you're right, higher ed is very uniquely positioned to do. And I think that's an opportunity to create space for dialogue and understanding and lift that up to the broader community. But
Yeah.
that hasn't always happened, I will say,
Right.
unfortunately.
Right. Yes. So what advice would you give someone transitioning into higher education from another industry? Sir, what to expect maybe, or yeah, just like if they're coming from government or nonprofit or corporate, like
Yeah.
what advice
I
would you
think
have?
I was going to say there's oftentimes a bit of a downer note to start on, but like a big bureaucracy to navigate and manage, which is probably very similar to coming from the government sector. But I think that assessing the culture is really important, and if it's maybe the right fit for you, because like I mentioned earlier, I think there's such a breadth of experiences with higher ed. Um, you know, are 20 people interviewing you? That might indicate that it's a very collaborative workplace, or is it more hierarchical? And I think that knowing to higher ed definitely has a rhythm, like maybe do your communications planning in the summer, because the rest of the year you're going to be pulled into a lot of projects. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's a really great place to work if you love learning and you want to, maybe audit a couple of courses or sit in on a lecture. I think the places I've worked have been very open environments to that. And I think that's been a really nice sort of unwritten perk of working in higher education, is that's really valued and, hopefully is part of the culture. I think it would be a red flag if it wasn't. But it's definitely you will encounter two folks who have worked there for 20, 30, 40 years, especially tenured professors. So it's really interesting, I think, to go in and see how things have changed over the years. And especially as communicators, it's important to get to know your colleagues, the students, have those conversations just casually with everybody. But if you're building a communications plan, again, just get to know your audience. And a lot of that is the people you're in a building with every day, with other professors, with students, with who you want to reach.
Yeah, I feel like the campus community, like just and how large it is and diverse. I mean, I, we had an interview with JD.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and
Yeah.
he was talking about how the students keep them young, right? Like, so yeah, so the importance of like, yeah, feeling and being connected to the campus community, because then you can have all those benefits, right? Of just like vibing off of other people who are working in totally different
Yeah.
silos or different groups. But yeah, I think that's definitely something beautiful about higher ed. Well, I guess that kind of wraps up unless there's any like last minute tips, but
Can I say one more thing? I'm
yeah.
realizing I forgot. Okay, I'm trying to think of where the best place was to insert this. I will also say one of the things about higher ed communications, specifically with design, is around accessibility. And I think this is something I didn't know a ton about before I worked in higher ed. And oftentimes it's related to compliance, and that's very important to do. But just generally, best practices around accessibility are going to make your website, social media appeal to so many more people and make it a better experience for folks. So I think that's key. And then also on the design front with the emerging trends, I was thinking, sometimes higher ed, you get pushback when you're slightly redesigning the logo you had from 1868. So there's a sort of weird, I don't want to say weird, but like, I think sometimes folks want things to be the same as when they went to school there. And I think what's a tightrope to walk in higher ed is this well, I want things to appeal to a new generation of people. And a big part of that is the design. You want to follow best practices
Mhm.
with mobile and social and being plugged into advertising like SEO, GEO, all these different pieces. Um, and at the same time, things do need to modernize sometimes. So how do you bring folks along and always, kind of explain like the reason we're doing this is because this will make our designs more accessible to people, or this will, you can read this when it's this big instead of printed out on letterhead or something to fax. So I think that's depending on your institution, like some tend to be more traditional than others, and some alumni are more traditional than others. But all of those stakeholders you kind of have to consider when making design decisions. So, yes, I would say always think through who's going to be receiving these communications, and when you're making any changes to the visual brand,
Yeah.
proceed with caution and a clear direction, and be prepared to explain why you changed things.
Yeah. Yeah. I always find it, I mean, it's not it shouldn't be so surprising, but how people feel so connected to
Yes.
these like elements that are just, yeah, it's just like a logo or even or renaming something, right, is always a huge, big undertaking. But I think people just kind of forget that, yeah, there are some people who will be very affected by these kind of changes, and making sure to bring them in to the process and feel like that they've had a say in it. So that's a very, I think, something most people aren't aware of unless they're the ones doing that
Mm-hmm.
change in that
Yeah.
communication. Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks, Erin, so much for being part of today's episode. If you're exploring, starting, or growing a career in higher education, visit hercjobs.org for job opportunities and career resources to support your next move. And join us next time on Let's Talk Higher Ed Careers for more real stories and practical advice from across the higher ed community. Thanks.
Thank you.